You're listening to the SEL in Action podcast, the podcast where we explore what social and emotional learning looks like in educational and professional settings. I'm your host, Heather Woods, and today on episode 2, we will be speaking with Dr. Eric Wooltorton about what social and emotional competencies are required in medical education, particularly when we're learning online. This episode is part of the Social and Emotional Competencies in Distance Leadership series. So today I am speaking with Eric Wooltorton. He is a family practitioner and medical educator and curriculum and faculty developer. That is what I stole from your Twitter. So Eric, you and I have been talking a little bit over email and social media about these kind of different social emotional skills and kind of what's involved with self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship building, decision-making competencies, and kind of how that relates to your role as a medical practitioner, but also medical educator. And so I'm wondering what you kind of see now with this shift of more online learning and online practice. I don't know if you're seeing clients like virtually or teleconferencing, but what are kind of like maybe one or two skills that really stand out to you that you think are applicable for practitioners and educators and students?
Well, it's a good question. I think it's some of the same skills that were there before we were online, but certainly that sense of self-awareness. And I find it really interesting how health professionals always have a very emotional dimension to their practice. I think it's part of what makes them curious about people. Their sense of empathy, their sense of curiosity. And if I have a learner, for example, who's got a patient they're having a teleconference with, I'm amazed at how often they'll have this need to sort of talk about afterwards, how that person made them feel, recognizing how to, that's a big part of that visit. Is it's not just what happens in the visit, the medical decisions you make, but it's the impact it has on you in terms of the things that stimulate you to learn more, the things that make you feel a little bit icky, and maybe like you need to explore this a bit more, maybe because you don't know much about the problem. Maybe it's because the patient rubbed you the wrong way, because there was a bit of a disconnect because of the virtual type of visit and the difficulty with figuring out what was going on. Or I've literally had people sort of unpacking their groceries and stuffing things in the freezer while they're talking to me. So it sometimes can generate a certain set of emotions in you where you think, can you just focus for a minute? I'm here right now, and before you lock yourself in your freezer, could we just talk about your headache? Maybe maybe you're getting a little bit too much cold, because your head's in the freezer. I think it's interesting, that notion of self-awareness, recognizing that's a big part of what we do. And then actually for a learner and as a medical educator, I spend a lot of time encouraging people to be aware of that and not to let go of that. Because I think people in health professions are very good at learning to have empathy trained out of them. They go into healthcare often with a lot of interest in helping people. Somewhere, in medical school, for various reasons, often because there's a lot of pressures on them, they will often develop a sort of lack of empathy. And so I keep telling people, if people make you feel something, that's good. Let it come in, process it, let it go out so that, you don't, it doesn't eat away at you. But use that to stimulate your learning and to find ways, if you didn't connect well with a patient, try to understand, are they transferring to you some of their feelings of frustration, some of their anxieties about themselves, and listen to that feeling. It's what ultimately will help you succeed in your profession or possibly develop burnout later. So that self-awareness is something I think is making people aware. And I think the other angle on this with the virtual supervision and care is that sometimes, a patient will be at home, I will have a learner calling the patient from home, and I'll be in a different location. Unless we make time to have those conversations and that dialogue, what will happen is a person will have those feelings and maybe not share it with somebody in their social group, that social learning that happens in medical education context or health professions education context, where you help that person stay in a zone where they're learning something from it. They're not feeling overwhelmed. You're able to sort of pick up on the challenges and the stresses they're having. And I think making sure that we make time to communicate deliberately about these things is really important in a virtual world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is an interesting point that, maybe we don't think about so much. I know, like, my supervisors, other students are all counseling students. And so those connections that maybe as they move into like their second year and they're going into placement and practicum, same thing for the medical students, right? Like there is those conversations, because I always tell them, I'm like, I'm not a counselor, but I can see how emotionally straining and stressful moving into practicum is. And so I tell them, like, make sure that you're talking to people and making like your connections and having your coping strategies in place, and your social network and everything. But I think, you almost don't think about it now that we've shifted to online, like, how are they going to navigate that? And like, you're right, like the onus, we've got to consciously and deliberately make those opportunities. It's really, really interesting.
Social learning is such a big part of developing an understanding of the norms of a profession, no matter what your profession, if it's nursing, if it's medicine, dietary, you're going to have people who ultimately they develop an identity. And part of that is the knowledge and the attitudes. Now, that can be positive. You can develop positive attitudes. You can also develop negative attitudes. I think one of the things that a lot of people describe at all levels of health professions right now is it can feel very isolating. In fact, I was having a conversation with another staff physician about this, where, when you're not in the same workplace as other people who are in the same field, you can feel very isolated, very alone. And I think it's important that we keep trying to reach out and understand, especially when people are developing a sense of who they are at the beginning of their training. It's important to create times when you're deliberately reaching out, connecting. And if you have 5 minutes of teaching, just make sure you have 5 minutes of making sure you ask how the person's doing, any cases they struggled with or challenges they're having. Because I think that, good leaders will have an awful lot of emotional intelligence. Good leaders, I think, will also be able to pick up on some of those things that people are communicating to you. And often it's through very informal dialogue. And I think the challenge is to keep people growing. And then it's often to just pick up if people are overtaxed or undertaxed, because if you don't stimulate people enough, they'll be quite disinterested and bored and also not grow. So from an educator's perspective, that idea of making sure there's that conversation, that dialogue that sort of keeps people in a growth zone.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned in terms of self-awareness, feeling it and letting like you feel those emotions and then processing it. So what does processing and maybe coping? I know in our emails together we were talking about like fear and like fear of messing up, or all the things that could go with fear in terms of the medical profession. What does that processing and coping strategy maybe look like? And for in practice, and maybe you supporting your learners at this, odd time.
It's really important. I think that idea of reflection, I think everybody remembers in healthcare training that time, the first time you were you transition from one level where you were a bit of a wallflower, kind of watching at the back of the room, to suddenly having responsibility, and that fear that you were going to miss something or hurt somebody or make a mistake. And I think that that fear of failure is such a big part of what drives a lot of people, especially in healthcare. You see all sorts of things that can be very dramatic. Certainly, we can all have bad days, and the challenges that we run into in healthcare are no different than a lot of other teachers, trying to teach people who are struggling with learning. But sometimes the consequences of a person making a mistake can be quite dire. And so teaching people, I think, that idea of building reflection into their day so that they're reflecting on what they did, so that notion of reflecting on what they did, but also getting to the point where they're sort of talking out loud and reflecting in action. So I'm doing this, and this is what I'm thinking. it helps you, I think if you have those conversations, you can untangle ways of moving forward so that you can plan a solid course of action that they develop more confidence. So much of being a health professional is about being self-regulated. I mean, we have a college that, will slap us on the wrist pretty hard if we do something wrong. People can complain to, and it's really important to have those regulatory bodies. But self-regulation and self-regulated learning is such a big part of what keeps us going as a lifelong learner. You're having to keep up on subjects. So teaching people those emotional skills to recognize the kinds of patients who trigger them emotionally. They're sort of Achilles heel. If you can imagine that, we all have the kind of patient who will push our buttons. The sooner that you can recognize that, or the sooner you can recognize the kind of context, you can actually start to talk yourself through it. And I say to my learners, it's like learning to drive a car. I know that when it gets icy out, I have to recognize, first of all, the conditions where I might go off the road. What am I going to do? Well, I'm going to maybe slow it down a little bit. So if I have a patient who will set me off because I want to be very efficient and they want to really go through things very slowly, I'll maybe make sure I go a little bit more slowly. I'll book a little bit more time. I'll anticipate the problem. I'll also talk out loud and tell people around me, like the nurses I'm working with and others around, that if I'm running behind, just let me deal with this right now. This is what's going on, and help them be aware. Just like if I'm driving in the car with people and it's icy out and I'm going a little bit more slowly, I'm just talking out loud. I'm taking all those thought processes and making them verbal. And I'm also sometimes very clear with patients. This is what I'm doing, and just talking through very clearly with them. And really, it turns those situations from ones where I'm feeling out of control or like there's something going to go wrong to one where I feel a little bit more like I've negotiated the situation well. So self-regulation is a big part of what we do, and encouraging people to reflect on the feelings that they're having as part of their day-to-day practice, I think is such an important part of being in this field, being resilient and successful and not burning out, because you want to have fun. You want to make sure that the patients are ones who stimulate you, and you're not avoiding patients you don't like. You have to make sure you're taking care of everybody the same way and succeeding.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in terms of like working with either your students or patients, in terms of like building those relationships, you've kind of talked about empathy, and checking in and kind of making sure that your students are all right and processing their emotions with their practice and everything, and so it really kind of, and then you highlight the communication piece. So I don't know if you intend to do this, but when you're thinking out loud and with a patient or with students or with your colleagues, you're communicating what you're doing. And so they're able to then there's a lot of subtleties there that are happening that, create that social climate, and therefore like awareness to some extent, right? So it's so interesting to see all these bits kind of overlap.
Well, I talk about how you can take different parts of medicine and just transpose them from one part to the other. Like I was telling a new learner today that it's like when we do a type of examination called an OSCE. It's a simulated clinical examination. And if the exam station says, I want you to examine this patient's heart, the mistake I made when I was a medical student is I put my stethoscope in my ears and I just started examining the patient's heart, because I thought they literally wanted me to examine the patient's heart. And I couldn't even hear that the bell had rung, that the station was over, and I was already supposed to go on to the next station. I was just listening around, and I remember that feedback early on to say, you should be talking out loud. Tell the person who's an examiner what it is you're doing, because they can't see your thoughts. They can't see what you're doing. You just look like you're off into space, which I probably was. But the reality was, the more that you can do that with patients as well, you can make sure you're on the same page, not only with their illness, but their illness experience. And I think that that's really important when you're talking to a patient. In family medicine, the notion of the illness and understanding the illness experience as well is really, really key. It's the same with learners. If they're getting to the right diagnosis, but they've got all of this baggage that goes along with the way the interview went, or just things they're really struggling with, and they're not talking out loud, then they're really missing an opportunity to grow and to learn. I think the other thing is, this is where notions that come in that are really important, I think, for us to get at as medical educators, things like unconscious bias. When you get people to start talking out loud, they can start to see that their ways of thinking might have been distorted by their previous experiences. And you can help them reflect a little bit on themselves, just like a mirror, holding a mirror up to them. When they're articulating certain things and you're articulating it back, you can help them maybe start to realize some of the things that they might be missing. And this is where you have to create a safe place for dialogue. And as medical educators, the more honest we are with the fact that we're human, that we've made mistakes, you have to have empathy for yourself and understand that this is a safe learning environment. Honest conversations about the sorts of mistakes you've made will, I think, allow people to self-reflect and maybe spot things that they didn't realize were some of their gaps in their thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of our jobs, I think, as medical educators.
Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if, maybe this shift to online practice and online learning and managing students, that, are you able to engage in that thinking aloud kind of process in the same way? Are you noticing that kind of changing at all or not changing?
What I've noticed is when you're doing online work exclusively, you're much more task focused. And what I've found is that so much of health professions education, so much of medical learning is a social education process. When you take out the social part and you're socially distanced from your learners, and it's actually quite possible that you're missing opportunities unless you're very deliberate about it. And it's tricky to, in a busy day, to sometimes work that in. You realize when you sit with a learner, if you're just talking about the patients who are in front of you or the medical, like the cognitive knowledge problems they're having, you're missing an enormous part of their education. I think people probably find that in other fields too. People who are working with, school-age children, if you're only focused on whether the person got the right answer or not on their fractions questions, you might be missing the fact that this kid is really struggling in some other sphere. And I think that's as a coach, as a mentor for a lot of these learners, I think we really have to make sure we're being much more deliberate about taking some time, programming in some time to have some conversations day to day. If we're not in the same place, we're going to be missing about 1,000 times a day when we just, you spot little things that are happening in that person, the way they phrase something, even the amount of time they can take with something, or just the way they'll be rubbing their temples, that sort of idea of I'm so stressed and I'm so exhausted right now. So we have challenges moving ahead. I think that's possibly one of the roles of mentorship as well, is to maybe split up some of these roles so that we have other people having honest conversations with people about how they're doing and giving them a chance to in a sort of non-evaluative kind of way, talk about how they're coping, how they're feeling, give them a chance to grow and develop, and maybe talk through some of those challenges they're having. I still think, though, on a day-to-day basis, as preceptors and clinical coaches, we have to play that role of spotting somebody who's maybe struggling and struggling more than they need to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely presents a unique challenge for building in those, like we've been calling it, like the water cooler conversations, right? Like those just informal interactions that you would normally be having that no longer happen.
Yeah, it's very hard.
So what would you say are some of like the essential skills, like social emotional skills, that medical educators can foster within their students?
I would say, basically spotting, being much more self-aware, and also not being afraid to identify their emotions. And I think that a lot of times you're taught in medicine that you shouldn't, you have to be a little bit removed and dispassionate. I would actually, I actively encourage people to talk about how they're feeling. for the sake of being able to process what that means. And sometimes, as I said, it's a fear of failure. Sometimes many times our learners they beat themselves up way too much, and they need reassurance that they are within the norm. So to help them understand that while being self-regulated means you have to be self-critical, you don't have to be your worst critic all the time. Like, I think, you have to let yourself breathe. You also have to look out for each other. And I think that notion of having empathy for others, realizing that traditionally health professions education, we're very good at assessing individual competence. But what you begin to realize in a leadership role is that people are competent within a context and as a team. So teaching them to figure out how to cross-link with that other learner, maybe who's seen the same patient before, to have a conversation, they don't feel alone. Also, where possible, to try to do group teaching. And I think that idea that I think shared experiences are ones where people don't feel isolated. Because I think that the way things are being done right now, with a whole bunch of online learning, a whole bunch of people working off in their own corners, it's about individual competence. It's not about teams feeling like they're part of a normal trajectory, that they're part of a growth, that other people are wondering the same things, they're not deficient. So teaching them to basically keep thinking as teams, keep working, reaching out, making connections. And I would also say, encouraging people just to informally connect. And I think that's where there's an advantage for medical educators, I think, to have their ear to the ground, not just in terms of the electronic work platforms, the email and the electronic records and so on, but I think also being on things like Twitter allows you to understand some of the experiences that medical students or residents or other learners who are feeling. What are some of their reactions? What are some of the reactions within the community? And I think that the better social awareness you can have as a medical educator will allow you to take a different perspective. It's not uncommon that any one of us will go into work with our own agenda. We forget that people are coming at this from their own, with their own challenges. The more that you're more aware of the other things that are going on in the community, the better you can be.
Mm-hmm. And it raises a really interesting point in terms of like the social awareness. A lot of people don't think about, the digital social networks that could be leveraged. I know like Twitter is huge in the medical education community. It's huge in the teacher community. And then I hear from kids that only old people are on Twitter. I'm like, yeah, that's okay with me. But like we're building these online professional learning communities that I think are providing, like you said, that opportunity to get a sense of what's happening, but then also take different perspectives. You have so many different voices that you're able to kind of listen in on.
Well, and kids, my kids, I have a lot of children, and they will say the same sort of things like, you're so old, you have no connection. And I'll say, but do you ever have that happen when you find that perfect meme that like just captures that thing that you're feeling? And other social sites, like I tell people, like on Pinterest, like it's not just for, tips on how to, do cool things with watermelons and, backyard projects. There's great teacher education sites, or if you have a focused interest on online learning, you can certainly get an awful lot of ideas. It links to all kinds of blogs, but it's just so gratifying when you find a meme that just sort of expresses what you're feeling in that moment, or yeah, I got it. And even if it's just for the sake of saying, like, you feel like you're not alone. You feel like you're part of a bigger community, a bigger conversation, and just how people conceptualize things. And kids get that. They go, yeah, I get that. But yeah, it's part of, I think that notion of saying, be part of the conversation, even if it's not your conversation. You can be a listener, and it will help you understand some of the arguments that are made when people are feeling one thing or another. And it can be around, I remember having this conversation about a learner where there's a every year one of the medical organizations, I think, organizes a program called Crazy Socks for Docs. And it's this idea that it's sort of an awareness raising campaign that if you wear sort of crazy socks underneath your clothes, people kind of go like, it can be mismatched or whatever. It's this idea that I have empathy for people in our profession who are dealing with astronomically high rates of burnout, depression, suicide. It's an epidemic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of my learners said, "This is ridiculous. The fact that this is not the same." And I already had kind of identified from some of the chatter online that there are some people who say this offends me, that this is the institutional response, that we should put on different stockings. And I said, yeah, that it's the start of a conversation. The fact that we're having this conversation means you're feeling something, and that's
Mm-hmm.
good. Let's talk about what that means. So being part of those online communities makes you aware of where the chatter is and how to, as a leader, address some of the concerns that people are going to come to you with, and you're not blindsided.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say is like a critical strategy or practice, like one or two critical strategies or practices that doctors or medical educators can kind of implement as we move forward online?
Yeah, I'd go back to dialogue. I'd say safe, honest conversation with the reason for social learning and mentorship and self-reflection. And I'd say, creating opportunities for dialogue would probably be the biggest and most important thing. It's nice to have a bit of an agenda. What I've learned is have an agenda to cover, especially if you're not going anywhere. It's awkward to have made an appointment with somebody and have nothing to talk about. But feel free to deviate from that agenda. And I think the other thing I would say in terms of emotions is I think that true transformative learning, the truly valuable developments that people have, come when people feel something from the encounter. And you can look at whichever learning theory you want, but I think recognizing that you feel something, and sometimes you're feeling a little bit disoriented, or you feel strongly about a patient encounter, recognizing that as an opportunity for growth is such an important thing. That capturing that, letting the person sometimes just get through the day, because I think we've all had that in healthcare. You have to debrief if there's an adverse event or something goes wrong. You need to just sort of have a quick little debrief, like what happened and how's everybody doing, and then when you have a chance to truly talk about it, make some time again to say, how can we just talk about what happened there? Because quickly people will sometimes just short circuit and say, I don't want to ever encounter that kind of person again, or I don't ever want to go into the room. I don't want to be the first person at the code. But if you break it down and say there's something, you're feeling something like, bigger and deeper, they have an opportunity for growth. So creating, I think, opportunities for safe dialogue and recognizing opportunities for transformative learning would be two things I would say.
Mm-hmm. And anything else that you can kind of think is important to mention in regards to, medical education, practice, being online right now with who knows what's going to happen in the fall and winter terms?
One of the things I would say is I've learned for medical educators, the easiest kind of presentation to give is a lecture. It's what we've often grown up with. It's often the least effective at actually for everybody. You feel the least good when you're doing it as an online presenter. You can't test people's understanding really of material. It can feel quite terrible. So if people are going to do online teaching, don't just lecture online. Make sure that it's much more engaging. Try to figure out how to have those conversations. Use some of the electronic tools to have those little breakout rooms or those conversations. Figure out how to make things case-based and pick up the speed a little. Make things short so that you just don't feel so exhausted by the end of it as a presenter or as a participant. Try to have, the online format allows us to have all sorts of fun audiovisual components that were not necessarily part of it before. And it sometimes allows you to do things asynchronously. So you can have a chance for people to watch a little bit longer video clip. If you're doing something live, it might be 10 or 12-minute video you'd watch at most. If it's something a little longer, if it's a movie or something you want them to watch, they can watch it on their own and then just have a more animated discussion. So more of a flipped classroom kind of approach. So if people are going to teach online, use this as an opportunity to do something cool, fun, funky, explore your skills, feel like a novice, fail. I mean, I'm a master at failure. I fail. Most online things fail more often than they work for me.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Eric. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and to my to my class. And yeah, that was really, really great. So thank you so much.
Well, I hope I get a chance to meet some of your group at some point. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to the SEL in Action podcast with Heather Woods. If you like the show and want to know more, check out SEL-in-action.com or leave us a review on iTunes. Be sure to follow SEL in Action on Facebook and Twitter for updates on our podcast. I'll talk to you soon.